Ensign Talik felt the deck buck beneath his boots before the alarms even started. Sparks rained from the ceiling conduits above the tactical station, and somewhere below him, 3 decks down, something screamed in a language that was mostly just tearing metal. His console flashed red, then black, then red again. The numbers on it made no sense. 9 minutes. That was all the chronometer said had passed since the first contact ping. 9 minutes since the Eternal Conquest had entered a system the Empire's charts still marked, in careful bronze lettering, as unclaimed. He grabbed the edge of his station as the ship rolled hard to port, and through the viewport he watched a second flagship, the Iron Devotion, 600 meters of hardened alloy his people had built to survive anything, come apart in complete silence. No explosion sound reached him. Vacuum didn't carry screams. It just carried debris, and the debris was headed toward him. Admiral Zarvok isn't answering. Someone shouted from the comms pit. Talik didn't recognize the voice anymore. Fear did that. He looked down at his display one more time before the lights failed entirely. 47 contacts, not ships. Something smaller, colder, already moving. He had seen the shape of the number for less than a second before the bridge went dark, and the last thing he heard, before he threw himself under the console, was the ship's own hull groaning like it wanted to apologize to him. 9 minutes. The fleet that had conquered 43 worlds without losing a single flagship was not going to make it to 10. I wish I could tell you what happened in the silence after that. I can't, not yet. But I can tell you this much. Nobody on that bridge believed, when the day started, that it would end this way. Stay with me. It gets worse before anyone understands why. 12 years earlier, in a chamber built from the bones of a conquered moon, Elder Vesari stood up when no one expected her to. The Vrethkai War Room on Vrethkai held 92 species in curved stone rows, under a ceiling of transparent crystal that had taken 3,000 years and 100,000 workers to raise. The air smelled of ozone and old incense, the kind that clung to a room that had never once been aired out in the Empire's 9,000-year memory. Admiral Zarvok stood at the center of it, armor the color of dried blood, a targeting lens where his left eye used to be. He had given this speech 7 times before, on 7 different worlds, and every time the vote had gone the same way. Sector 74 Omega, he said. His voice carried the dry rasp of centuries spent shouting orders into vacuum. Uncharted, no known spacefaring capability. Population 9 billion. Resistance expected minimal. He touched the scar on his right forearm, the one from his first campaign, out of habit more than memory. I request the Council's blessing to annex. Vesari rose from the highest row. She was small, 488 years old, and her voice did not carry the way Zarvok's did. It didn't need to. The chamber quieted anyway. There's something in that system, she said. A pattern, a structure. I don't know what it means, but I know silence when I hear it, and this is not the silence of nothing. Zarvok didn't even turn to look at her. You said the same thing about Sector 39. Sector 39 had no silence, Vesari said. This system has silence, deep silence. The kind that means something is listening. The vote came back 89-3. Chancellor Thrax, 500 years old and dismissive of anything that couldn't be measured in conquered flags, waved a hand toward the display. Proceed, Admiral. An elder perhaps rest. You've grown cautious in your old age. Only one person in the chamber didn't laugh at that. Commander Vex, a Kovani observer 207 years into a long career of watching other species make the same mistakes twice, kept his eyes on Vesari as she sat back down. He didn't say anything. He just noticed the way her hands were shaking, and filed it away, the way he filed everything away. 47 light years from that chamber, on a moon 12 kilometers of rock away from a sun no Vrethkai star chart had ever named, Admiral Sora Chen set a cracked ceramic cup down beside a photograph she never looked at while working. Pale Reach Station ran quiet at this hour, the kind of quiet that came from 300 people trying not to make noise they didn't have to make. Chen filled the cup with cold tea, the way she always did before a long watch, and touched the edge of the photograph once without turning it toward her. A boy, 14 years old, who had no idea where his mother actually worked or why she never came home in time for his birthday. Commander Rakesh, she said, not looking up from the display. Report, all platforms report green, Rakesh said. 47 of 47 online. Choi's been tracking the approach vector for 18 minutes now. They're coming in exactly where the models said they would. Chen nodded once. She didn't smile. She hadn't smiled during an operation in longer than she could remember. And the decoy buoys, holding. As far as their sensors are concerned, this is an empty system with some interesting rock formations. Good, Chen said. She wrapped both hands around the cup but didn't drink from it. Not yet. Let them believe that for as long as they can. Somewhere behind her, a junior officer, whose name she hadn't learned yet, whispered to another that the admiral hadn't slept in 2 days. Chen heard it. She let it go. There would be time to sleep when the waiting was over, and the waiting had been going on for 12 years already. A little longer wouldn't kill her. It might, however, kill several thousand people who did not yet know they were already inside the trap. Back aboard the Eternal Conquest, 6 hours before any of that mattered, Ensign Talik logged the final approach vectors and thought, not for the first time, that this was the easiest posting he had ever drawn. No resistance expected. A primitive system. He'd catalog the annexation, note the timestamps, and be home in time to see his sister's naming ceremony. That was the plan. His console flickered. He frowned at it, tapped the panel twice, and watched 47 separate heat signatures bloom across the asteroid belt at the exact coordinates an old half-mad elder had warned them about 12 years before anyone on this bridge had been born into the Empire's service. He stood up. "Admiral, sit down, Ensign," Zarvok said, without looking away from the forward viewport, where the belt hung dark and patient and full of rock that was not entirely rock. Primitive bravado. "Proceed." Talik sat down. It would be the last order given before 9 minutes swallowed everything he understood about the universe he'd been born into. The message went out from the Eternal Conquest in the flat, ceremonial language the Empire had used to open every annexation for 9,000 years. "You are now the property of the Galactic Empire," the transmission said, translated instantly into whatever crude tongue the system's inhabitants used. "You have 5 of your minutes to acknowledge." The reply came back in less time than it took Zarvok to sit down in his command chair. "You are entering a sovereign territory. You have been warned." Zarvok laughed. It was a dry, scraping sound, the kind that came from a throat that had spent centuries issuing orders in vacuum-sealed chambers. "Primitive bravado," he said again, as if repeating it made it truer. "Proceed on approach vector." Talik stayed seated this time. He kept his eyes on his display instead, where the 47 signatures in the belt hadn't moved, hadn't reacted, hadn't done anything at all since they'd first bloomed into view. That, more than anything, bothered him. Things that didn't move when a fleet of this size bore down on them were either dead, or they were waiting for something specific to happen first. He didn't say that out loud. He'd learned that lesson already today. On Pale Reach Station, Lieutenant Choi didn't look up from her console when she spoke. They took the bait. "Decoy boys are holding. Their sensors think this whole belt is nothing but rock and old mining debris. They believe what they expect to find," Chen said. She was still holding the cup, still hadn't drunk from it. "That's the only weapon that's ever mattered in this fight. Not the mines, not the platforms. What they expect to see." Commander Rakesh crossed the room to stand beside her, arms folded, watching the same tactical display she was. 12 years, he said quietly. 12 years of drills, and it comes down to 18 minutes of them flying in a straight line. It comes down to whether they keep flying in that straight line, Chen said. People who've never lost stop checking their assumptions. That's the gift they gave us the day they decided we weren't worth watching closely. Rakesh didn't answer that. He didn't need to. She kept the photograph beside the cup as a kind of proof to herself that the waiting had a reason, that somewhere past all these years of drills, there was still a boy who needed his mother to come home in one piece. Everyone on that station had spent over a decade of their lives preparing for a single morning, and none of them had ever been entirely sure it would come. Some had stopped believing it would. Chen never had. And a system full of people who'd never asked to be anyone's battlefield. Elder Vessery watched the war room's displays from her seat in the highest row, and for the first time in 12 years, she allowed herself to hope she'd been wrong. Commander Vex noticed. He always noticed things like that, the small tell of an old woman's hands finally going still instead of shaking. He leaned toward her, keeping his voice below the murmur of the chamber. "You don't look worried anymore, Elder." "I'm not," Vessery said. "I was worried when I thought no one was listening on that side of the silence. Now I think someone has been listening the whole time. That's a different feeling entirely." Vex frowned. "Zarvok has taken 43 worlds without losing a ship. Zarvok has taken 43 worlds that never once made him wait," Vessery said, This system has made the Empire wait for 12 years and never explained why. He should have asked why before he flew into it. Talik watched the belt for another 40 minutes, and in all that time, nothing changed except the numbers ticking down on the approach clock. He almost convinced himself it really was nothing. Rock, debris. An old elder's superstition given too much weight by a council that liked drama more than evidence. Then the belt lit up. Not with fire, with motion. Every one of the 47 signatures shifting at once, in perfect coordination, the way nothing natural ever moved. Talik's stomach dropped before his mind caught up to what his eyes were telling him. "Admiral," he said, and this time he didn't sit back down when Zarvok turned to look at him. "They're not debris, they're active." For the first time since the mission began, Zarvok didn't dismiss him outright. He simply stared at the display for 3 long seconds, his jaw tightening, the scar on his forearm forgotten under his gauntlet. "Increase shield output," he said. "All decks." This is not a drill. It was the closest thing to fear Talik had ever heard in the old admiral's voice, and it came 4 minutes too late to matter. Chen set the cup down without drinking from it, the tea gone cold an hour ago, and folded her hands behind her back the way she always did in the last minute before a decision that couldn't be taken back. "They've raised shields," Riksh reported. "They know something's wrong. They know something's different," Chen said. "That's not the same as knowing what it is." She looked at the display, at the long, patient line of the Vrekai fleet drifting exactly where they'd been meant to drift for 12 years of waiting. Radiant Protocol has been ready since before most of the crew on that station were born. It doesn't care whether they've raised their shields in the last 4 minutes of their lives. She turned to Choi. Status on the platforms. All 47 armed and holding position. "Waiting on your mark." Chen looked once more at the photograph beside the cold cup, and this time, for just a moment, she let herself look at it directly. A boy who liked drawing badly and playing worse music, who had no idea his mother had spent a third of his life preparing for a morning exactly like this one. She touched the frame once, the way she always did, and then didn't look at it again. "Engage Radiant Protocol," she said. "Fire on my mark." The order didn't sound like the end of anything. It sounded, Raiksh would say much later, like something closing a door that had been left open for 12 years, finally shutting on the people who'd never known it was there. Nobody on the Vrekai side heard it given. They only felt what came after. The first missile crossed the gap between the belt and the fleet in less time than it took Talik to draw a breath. He felt it before he understood it. A shudder through the deck, then another, then a rolling series of impacts that didn't sound like weapons fire so much as the ship's own bones breaking one at a time. The 47 signatures weren't ships at all. He understood that now, in the worst possible way. They were smaller than ships, faster than ships, and there were far more of them behind the ones they'd already counted. "Report!" Zarvok's voice cracked for the first time Talik had ever heard. "Shields at the flagship are holding," someone shouted from the tactical pit. "The Radiant Vigil just lost main power. The Ember Court isn't answering." Outside the viewport, in absolute silence, a warship that had crossed 9 systems without taking a scratch folded in on itself like something crushed in a fist. On pale reach, Chen watched the tactical display with the same stillness she'd carried into every drill for 12 years, though this was the first time the numbers on it were real. "First wave impact confirmed," Choi said, voice tight but steady. They didn't even see the mines separate from the debris field. "Second wave launching now." "Casualties on their side?" Raiksh asked, though he already knew what kind of answer that question deserved. "Most of the fleet," Chen said quietly. She didn't look away from the display. "That was always the plan." She didn't say it like a victory. She said it the way you'd report a diagnosis you'd already spent years bracing to hear. Aboard the Eternal Conquest, the lights failed on the bridge exactly 4 seconds before the first missile reached the command deck. Talik didn't remember deciding to move. His hand was already on the emergency shield override before his mind caught up with what his body had done, slamming the panel with both palms the way he'd been trained to on a simulator he'd never expected to use for anything real. The bulkhead sealed a heartbeat before the strike hit. The shock of it threw him from his chair and into the wall, and for a long moment there was nothing but ringing silence and the smell of burnt insulation. When he opened his eyes, the bridge was dark except for emergency lighting, and Zarvok's chair was empty. He didn't go looking for the Admiral's body. He would learn later, from records recovered off the wreck, that Zarvok had died at his post, eyes on the viewport until the very last. Talik crawled instead toward the escape hatch. past crew who weren't moving, past a comms officer whose final transmission had gone out unfinished, and he understood, somewhere in the numb center of himself, that he was the only one on that bridge still breathing. He would carry the smell of it for the rest of his life. Burnt metal, burnt everything. The sound underneath the alarms that he'd spent years trying not to remember, the sound of ground troop transports going dark one after another, faster than anyone could log the losses. In the war chamber on Vreth Kai, Chancellor Thrax received the first garbled transmission from the front and read it twice before he understood what it said. "This can't be accurate," he said. Confirm the source. An aide, young and pale under his scale plates, didn't answer right away. When he did, his voice barely carried past the front rows. "Confirmed, Chancellor. Fleet Command reports catastrophic losses. Contact was lost with Admiral Zarvok 11 minutes ago." The chamber, which had not gone silent for a single vote in longer than anyone present could remember, went silent now. Elder Vasari didn't stand this time. She didn't need to. Every eye in the room found her anyway. The way they always found the one person who had said 12 years ago that this system's silence meant something was listening. Commander Vex leaned toward her one more time. "You were right," he said so quietly it barely reached her. "We're about to find out." Nobody in the chamber spoke as the first recovered transmission began to play, not a report, not a summary, but a direct broadcast the human commander had sent out into open space, addressed to no one and everyone at once. "I was cautious," Vasari said. "There's a difference. I still don't know what we were listening to." Time-stamped almost exactly 9 minutes after the first mine had detonated. The image resolved slowly. A woman, unremarkable by any Vrethkai standard, sitting in a cold gray room with a cracked white cup in front of her. She wasn't shouting. She wasn't gloating. She looked, if anything, tired, the particular tiredness of someone who had waited a very long time for something they'd never wanted to happen. Thrax's hand hovered over the control that would cut the feed. He didn't press it, because behind the woman, faint but unmistakable on the display at her shoulder, the wreck of the Empire's fleet burned in silence, and she hadn't so much as glanced at it. "You are entering a sovereign territory," Chen said on the recording, her voice even and unhurried. "You have ignored 3 warnings. You have brought your weapons to a place that did not threaten you." She reached for the cracked ceramic cup without looking at it, the motion so ordinary it almost didn't belong in the same broadcast as the wreckage burning behind her. She took a sip. She set it back down exactly where it had been. "You believe your 9,000 years make you invincible," she said. "You are wrong." No one in the chamber moved. Thrax's hand had stopped hovering over the control and simply dropped to his side, forgotten. Visari sat with her own hands folded in her lap, still, the way they hadn't been still in 12 years. "You looked at us and saw a primitive species," Chen went on. "You looked at our ships and saw nothing. You looked at our silence and mistook it for weakness. That was your second mistake." She leaned forward just slightly, close enough that the camera caught the tired lines around her eyes. The first was coming here. She let that sit before the line that would end up quoted in council chambers on worlds that hadn't even been charted yet. "You mistake competence for luck. You mistake preparation for accident. You mistake the fact that we waited for you. For 12 years, we waited for cowardice." Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. It was not cowardice. It was patience. The transmission ended. For 17 seconds, nobody in the war chamber on Vrith Kai said a single word. Then, in the second row, a younger delegate, Kovani, like Vex, though decades junior, made a small sound in his throat, something between a laugh and a cough, and immediately looked ashamed of it. No one reprimanded him. No one had the will to. They played it again. Not because anyone requested it, but because the technician responsible for the feed had frozen at his station, hands still resting on the control, and simply hadn't thought to stop it from looping. The second time through, Vex watched Vesari instead of the screen. He had spent 200 years learning to read stillness in 100 different species, and hers was a stillness he hadn't seen on her before, not fear, not triumph. Something closer to grief for a version of the Empire that had died in that chamber alongside the fleet. "I don't think anyone in this chamber has ever had to imagine an enemy who plans on that scale without announcing a single part of it. That's what unsettles them," Vex said, nodding toward the rows below.
"You knew," he said quietly, when the recording ended a second time. "Not the shape of it, but you knew there was a shape. I knew there was patience," Vesari said. "I didn't know what patience like that could build in 12 years.
It's that nothing about the loss makes sense inside the shape of war they understand. aboard Pale Reach, where delegates from a dozen conquered worlds sat in a silence that had nothing performative left in it. Not that they lost a fleet. Fleets have been lost before. Ensign Talik, no longer aboard anything but a borrowed cot in the station's overflow medical bay, sat with his knees drawn up and watched the same recording on a data slate someone had left within his reach, whether by accident or design he couldn't say. 14 times now. He'd stopped counting after the 10th, then started again without meaning to. A medic passed by twice without speaking to him, the second time pausing just long enough to check the readout on his wrist. His hands hadn't stopped shaking since the shield override. Everyone in that bay already knew why, in the general shape of it, even if none of them knew the particular weight of watching a comms officer's last transmission end mid-sentence. The medic didn't ask why, or the smell that didn't leave a person's memory no matter how many times the ventilation cycled clean air past it. He thought about Zarvok only once, deliberately, and made himself finish the thought before letting it go. The old admiral had died facing the viewport, hands still near the console, the recovered logs would later say. Not running, not begging. Just wrong in the particular and total way that 9,000 years of being right had never prepared him to survive. Talik didn't know if that made him respect the man more or less. He decided it didn't matter which. In the chamber, Chancellor Thrax finally broke the silence the second playback had left behind. His voice came out smaller than Talik, watching from the recovery bay's own delayed feed, had ever imagined it could. Who are they? Visari rose from the highest row, slowly, the way she always did, though this time nobody laughed and nobody looked away. They are the ones who do not announce their strength, she said. They are the ones who do not threaten first. They are the ones who wait until the danger is already standing inside their door and only then do they speak. 12 years, Thrax said, as though the number itself were an accusation. We had reports. We had a formal warning. From you. You had a warning you chose not to understand, Vesari said. There was no satisfaction in her voice. If anything, there was something closer to exhaustion. I didn't ask you to trust me 12 years ago. I asked you to be curious. Curiosity has never been the Empire's strongest instinct. No one argued with her this time. There was nothing left to argue with. The fleet was gone. The certainty that had carried the Empire across 43 worlds without a single defeat had not survived the 44th. They brought Talik before the surviving officers panel 2 hours later. Not a tribunal, not yet. Just a room with 3 exhausted senior officers and a recorder no one had bothered to hide. You reported anomalous activity in the belt. One of them said, reading from a log. Twice, yes. And you were told to stand down. Both times, yes. The officer set the log down. Why did you engage the shield override without command authorization? Talik thought about that for longer than the room seemed comfortable with. Because no one was left to give the order, he said finally. And because I didn't want to be right about the anomaly and then die not having done anything with it. None of the 3 officers wrote that down. One of them looked for a moment like he might say something kind and then didn't. Vesari found him afterward, alone in the corridor outside the panel room. She didn't offer comfort. She had never been the kind of person who offered comfort easily, and Talik understood, somehow, that she respected him too much to start now. You told the Admiral to sit down, she said. It wasn't an accusation. It was worse than that. It was simple fact, laid flat on the table between them. He gave the order to proceed anyway. You were both wrong, and you are the one who has to carry it. Talik didn't answer. There wasn't an answer that fit. He thought, distantly, of the moment his hand had found the shield override before his mind had caught up to the decision. The one thing he'd done on instinct that had turned out to matter, out of 100 things he'd done on orders that hadn't mattered at all. What happens to me now? He asked. You survive, Vesari said. That is not a small assignment. Someone has to carry what happened back to people who will never believe it, unless they hear it from someone who was standing in the room. On Pale Reach Station, the tea in the cracked ceramic cup had gone cold hours ago, and Chen still hadn't poured it out. The frozen image of the Vrethkai fleet hung on the display beside her, wreckage catalogued into neat columns. Reksh had already started filing for the official record. Chuai had gone quiet at her station, the kind of quiet that came after 12 years of preparing for something and then finally watching it happen exactly the way the simulations had said it would. Command wants a statement, Rakesh said, for the wider network. Something for the people who don't know yet what the Radiant Protocol even was. Tell them the platforms held, Chen said. Tell them the drills mattered. Don't tell them it felt like anything, because it didn't. Not yet. It will later, when there's time to let it. Rach nodded and didn't push further. He had learned over 12 years working under her, which silences to leave alone. Chen picked up the photograph beside the cup for the first time since the operation had begun. She didn't turn it toward anyone. She just looked at it. At a boy who'd spent a third of his life not knowing what his mother did, and who still wouldn't know, not really, even after tonight. They'll send someone else, Rakesh said quietly. Eventually, maybe, Chen said. Or maybe an empire that's never had to wait for anything finally learns what it feels like. She set the photograph back down, careful, deliberate. Either way, we'll be ready. That's the only promise we ever made. She reached for the cup, finally, and lifted it, and stopped, halfway, the way she had all night, and set it back down, untouched, beside the frozen image of the fleet she had spent 12 years learning to end in 9 minutes. She had been waiting to drink it when the recording was done. Now it was done, and she found she wasn't thirsty anymore. She only wanted for a moment to sit in the quiet she had built with her own hands and let it be quiet, before the next thing came. Outside the station's narrow viewport, the belt that had hidden 47 platforms for 12 years drifted on, patient as it had always been, indifferent to whatever the Empire chose to call what had happened there. The silence it had kept for 12 years had never been a void. It had been a promise.